In this video, we're going to get started on our web project. Now, our web project is incredibly important because this is how our users are going to register for the game. They're going to be able to log in, download their launcher, and also this is where our launcher is going to look for the latest version of our client and grab the latest version and replace it and all that fun stuff. Also, we're going to be putting together our API for generating the token and authenticating our users. So the website seems like a pretty straightforward place to go ahead and get started. Now in this video, we're just going to get some preliminary stuff out of the way. Want to go ahead and build out a layout file, get a basic action going, and then we're going to throw in some Bootstrap and some less so that we don't have to work very hard at all to make the site or to build the HTML for this site, because obviously this isn't a web development course, but with Bootstrap we can put together a lot of fun stuff like tabs and menus and buttons and tables and stuff without having to teach everyone CSS. So to do that, let's go ahead and start off with creating our index controller, or home controller, sorry, and then our index action. I'm going to create a class on our controllers folder called home controller. He's going to inherit from controller. He's going to have one method in him with it's going to be public return type of action result. The name is going to be index, which is simply going to return a view. I'm also going to go ahead and get my view models set up. So I'm going to create a folder inside of BuzzMMO.web called view models. I'm going to create a view model class called home index, and it's just going to be blank. What's a view model? Well, a view model is basically a class that represents the data that our controller is going to send into our view. It also represents the data that the view can fill in and post back to the controller. Now, this is going to be empty for now, but in the future we might want to put stuff in like a message or something from the database, or maybe the link to the latest launcher or something like that. So for now, getting back to our home controller, I'm going to pass a new instantiation of our home index view model into the view method. So I'm going to simply say new home index. Now you'll notice that did bring a using BuzzMMO web view models up there on line 2. So now that I've created my home controller and my index action, I'm going to create my view for it. In addition to creating the view for our index action, I'm also going to create a layout file. And that layout file is going to be used to kind of create the Chrome for the entire website, so that we have some consistency between pages. So I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it shared. And then inside of shared, I'm going to create a new Razor MVC view, and I'm going to call it _layout. And we hit OK. The template that ReSharper gave me is pretty straightforward. I'm going to get rid of this top model declaration because it's unnecessary. I'm going to keep the layout equals null because the layout CSHTML file does not have a parent layout. The title of the page I'm going to make BuzzMMO, and then inside of body I'm simply going to say render content, or sorry, render body. And what this means is that if we use this layout file, all of the individual bits of code that we might put in our child views will get dumped here in between our body tags, which is what we want. Now I'm going to jump back into my views folder and I'm going to create a home folder, which of course already exists for some reason, which I'm going to delete that. I'm also going to delete a couple other of these things that are left over. Okay, so we'll want to create our, well, we'll definitely not want to hit F1 on accident. We're going to create our home folder. The home folder corresponds to the home controller that we created up here. By convention, by returning a view from a controller named home and a method named index, it's going to search for the corresponding view in a folder called home with a view file named index. So I'm going to go ahead and create a Razor MVC view, and I'm going to call it index. Now for the model, I'm going to type in home index which is going to autocomplete to buzzmmo.web.viewModels.home index, which is the full path to that view model. This is so that the view knows about the data that we're going to be passing into it from the controller. And then I'm just simply going to remove all of the existing code, and I'm going to do an h1 buzzmmo with a p. Welcome to the site. Do I have Lorem? No, I don't have the Lorem extension installed. All right, so that's all good. Now let's hit Control F5. Now, if Control F5 doesn't work for you, that's going to be because you don't have the default startup project set to your web project. If your web project isn't bolded, go ahead and right-click it and say Set as Startup Project, which is one of these buttons. Yeah, there it is. Make sure that you click on that so it's bold, so that when you hit Control F5, it's going to be launching your web project. Now, if I see the result of that, it's going to open up a Chrome window, but you notice we're going to get a 404. The reason we got a 404 is because it so helpfully decided to say that we're loading in views home index.cshtml. It's not actually how ASP.NET MVC works. I'm going to remove this and hit enter, and we're going to see our page. I'm going to right-click and hit View Source to verify that indeed our layout is not being loaded, because I completely forgot to specify the layout file for this particular view. That's because every view needs to be told explicitly which layout file it needs to use. That's why we don't see our things like our doc type or HTML or a head or a body in the view source. To fix this, we can fix this in one or two ways. We can set the layout manually on every single CHTML file that we have in our project, or we can come up here to Views, the parent Views folder, right-click, hit Add, hit New Code File, and I'm going to create a code file called view_viewstart.cshtml. Now, the _viewstart.cshtml is a Razor file that's going to be loaded at the beginning of every other Razor file, which allows me to set defaults such as layout equals squiggly slash, I know it's tilde, but I like squiggly, views shared layout. So by writing in this code, remember in Razor we differentiate between HTML and C# by using the @ symbol followed by curly braces if we're wishing to express a block of logic. And we're setting the layout default to layout.cshtml. If I come back here and hit refresh, you'll notice that stuff shifts just a tad, and I also get my title. That's because if I come in here to view source, you'll see that we have our doc typing loaded in, as well as our HTML, our head, our title, and all that fun stuff. Again, that's all from the layout.
Very nice.
All right, I know that this is not a web development tutorial, but I do want to point out for people who might not be so familiar with ASP.NET MVC why this works. Why does going to localhost 58564 give us our code that we typed in? Well, let's ignore the port and the host for now and talk about the path. You'll notice that there is no path. We're not saying home and we're not saying index. Now, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, if I go anywhere else, I'll get an HTTP 404, and 404 is the HTTP code for not found. However, I could go to home and I'll get my home page, or I could go to home/index and I'll get the same thing. So what is up with that? Why can't I get to the same page from 3 different locations? Both root, specifying our controller name, or specifying our action name and our controller name. Well, that's because of our routes. If we open up our app start folder, we'll have our routeconfig.cs file, which creates a default route. And the default route specifies variable controller name / variable action name / variable ID is going to be our route, our URL. And then you'll notice the defaults, our controller is set to home, and our action is set to index. That's why when we leave nothing out, we get our home controller and our index action. If we add in our home controller, that means we're specifying the controller as home explicitly, but our action is index by default, which gives us our index action, or we can fully qualify it as well if we wanted to. So for example, let's say I had an about page. So I have an about controller, and then maybe a company action, which would be a method underneath that class. To get to that URL or to that page, you would do about/company, because about would fill the controller and company would fill the action, just like what you see right here in this URL pattern. Anyway, so enough about that. We have a basic route set up with a basic site, and that's pretty cool. But let's do something even cooler. Let's go ahead and throw in some Bootstrap action. Now, what is Bootstrap? Bootstrap is a CSS framework. So basically, what it allows us to do is it allows us to write HTML in a particular way, and it'll just make it pretty for us. Well, not just pretty. It gives us a bunch of little widgets and other fun stuff like buttons, and I haven't got used to the new documentation, by the way. It gives us buttons, it gives us fonts or icons that's represented as fonts. We have drop downs that we could use for different styling. We have the nav bar, which we can see right here, labels, badges, page header. A lot of cool stuff that we basically get just by including Bootstrap. And this will prevent us from having to sit around and play with CSS all day in order to get the layouts that we want. Again, the website's going to be a very simple application. We're just really doing it so we can have a place for users to register and log in, and also have an API for uploading and downloading clients and launchers. But we might as well throw in Bootstrap so that we can get some functionality without having to write any CSS or much CSS. Now, there's another thing that we will be using. We will be using the less CSS processor. That is, I've been using less for many, many years, and what less is it's nothing more than an easier way to write CSS. Go ahead and check out the different language features. I have a video up on 3D Buzz you guys can watch about the introduction to some of the most common features of less. And basically, it just lets us write CSS faster. The reason why I choose less over things like Sass is because Bootstrap is primarily written in less. So Bootstrap is written in less, which allows us to take advantage of a lot of less's features in order to, again, prevent us from having to write a bunch of CSS. So what we need to do is we need to somehow make it so that we can write less on a server on our website and have it turned in to CSS on the browser. So to do that, we're going to pull in a few NuGet packages that'll handle that transformation for us automatically. I will note a couple of things. There is a C# implementation of less called .less, but unfortunately it's lacking behind the primary less compiler. Unfortunately, Bootstrap, the latest version of it, uses that latest compiler, so we cannot use .less to work with Bootstrap, or at least the latest version of Bootstrap. Less itself is written in JavaScript. Now, fortunately, there's some very convenient NuGet packages that we can just plop straight into our web application that'll give us less support for basically free. Let's go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to close out everything. I'm going to right-click References, go to Manage NuGet Packages, and I'm going to pull down a couple things. I'm going to pull down Bundle Transformer. And I want to pull in Bundle Transformer, where are you? Less. So that's on the second page here on the NuGet results. So I'm going to install this. Now this is going to bring in WebGrease as well as the Microsoft ASP.NET web optimization package, which is cool stuff that we need anyway. Now, that is almost everything that we need to work with less on an ASP.NET MVC application. We'll also need a JavaScript engine. That's because less uses JavaScript to compile, and we'll need a JavaScript engine in order for the bundle transformer to actually produce less. It doesn't come with a JavaScript engine itself. But fortunately, it's very easy to go ahead and grab one. It depends on the JavaScript engine switcher library. So let's go ahead and search online for JavaScript engine switcher. And we'll see we have Core, IntelliSense, V8, Jurassic, MSIE, and Gent. The one that we're going to be using is V8. For those of you familiar with web development, V8 is the JavaScript engine that Google wrote for the Chrome browser. So it's very fast and very nice to work with and blah, blah, blah. Now, what this does is this actually pulls in some native assemblies that contain the V8 JavaScript engine, and it'll invoke them for us in a wrapper. It's important to understand that we must have the Visual C++ Redist package for 2012 in order to run this. But that's okay, because that's really not a bad dependency to have. Most computers will have this installed anyway. And if you don't, you can just grab it online. If you are using Visual Studio 2012 right now, you already have the Redist package. So hit install, wait a year, and we're done. Okay, so we're not quite there yet. My goal is I want to be able to, let's say, create a basic less file that will be used to style our application. So I'm going to go into buzzmmo.web. I'm going to create a new folder called content. Inside of content, I'm going to create another folder called styles. Inside of styles, I'm going to right-click, hit add, go to code file, and I'm going to create an application.less file. Inside of application.less, I'm going to write some simple CSS that will change the background of our page to a very light gray. The reason I'm doing that is to make sure that things are working. I'll also use a less specific feature to style all H1s that are underneath body and give them a color of red. The reason I'm using a less specific feature for my less file, in this case, even though I don't need to, is so that I can make sure that my less preprocessors are working, which they won't be as of right now. Let's go ahead and see why. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-B and then Control-F5. Now you notice nothing changed. Nothing changed because I haven't actually included this less file into my index page or into my layout yet. But that's not what I'm shooting for right now. Right now I want to be able to go to Content, Styles, Application.less, and get back a CSS file. Unfortunately, you'll see an error. It says during the output text content, blah, blah, blah. During the output text content of processed asset and unknown. Am I having a stroke, or does this sentence make no sense?
No, that's the worst sentence I've ever seen.
Okay. Well, basically, we get a exception has been thrown by the target of invocation. The most unuseful error you could possibly experience in a managed world. Fortunately, though, I know what's wrong. What's wrong is that we haven't actually told our bundle transformer about our JavaScript engine. You'll notice one thing. We have a bunch of stuff in our web.doc config now, and a bunch of this stuff was automatically pulled in by adding those NuGet packages. And you'll see that the formatting of our config file got pretty much destroyed. To fix this, there's a really quick trick. You can just hit Control-A, Control-X, Control-V to cut and paste, and Visual Studio will auto-format our XML file for us so that it makes more sense. So again, a bunch of stuff got added. First of all, the runtime, ignore the runtime, we don't really care about that. These three elements, bundle transformer, JS engine switcher, and our system.web server, have all been added to our web.doc config file. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to configure our site to work with or to serve out less files. But we're not, like I said before, we're not quite done yet. We have our JavaScript engine switcher V8 JS engine added into our engine's element right here on line 50. If you don't have this here, that means you didn't install the JavaScript engine switcher V8 package. But what we need to do is we need to tell the bundle transformer to use this engine when compiling less. And that's pretty straightforward to do. On our bundle transformer, outside of the core element, we'll add a less element. Inside of the less element, we will add a JS engine element with the name of this, V8 JS engine. You'll want to copy and paste that to make sure the casing is correct. So now that we've done that, I'm going to hit F6 to rebuild. And I'm going to bring over our web browser and hit refresh. And now we see CSS. Now this CSS was compiled by the less compiler that was running on the V8 JavaScript engine. So let's go ahead and jump into application.less and compare these two. On the left-hand side you see less, and on the right-hand side you see CSS. Note that CSS does not support nested elements like less does, and when we compile the less into the corresponding CSS, it unnests the elements for us. So that's really cool. So we have now verified that less is indeed working. Now, let's go ahead and add our application.less into our layout file so that we can actually see the result of this CSS on our web page. Because right now, if we view source, we don't see any reference to our application.less file. To do that, I'm not going to simply go into views, shared layout, and add a link tag on my head element to point to that application.less file. The reason I'm not going to do that is there's a much more powerful way of handling this sort of thing in ASP.NET, and that is using bundles. Asset bundles allow us to write JavaScript and CSS and even less, or CoffeeScript or TypeScript or whatever random language they came up with yesterday, in a very convenient way that also supports optimization. So to work with bundles, I'm going to go into my app start folder. I'm going to create a class and I'm going to call it bundle config. This is just a convention that I do. It's actually a convention that you'll see used in a lot of the ASP.NET MVC templates that aren't empty. And this will be a static class, and it'll simply have a public static void register bundles method that takes in a bundle collection called bundles. Bundles. There we go. So bundle collection was pulled in from the system web optimization namespace, which you can see up here on line 1. So let's go ahead and create a bundle. I'm going to add a bundle, and I'm going to say new style bundle, and I'm going to give it a path. And this path is going to be basically the identifier that uniquely identifies our style bundle. And I'm going to simply call it styles front end. And then I threw in that squiggly to make this the root relative path of this application. My style bundle, I'm going to go ahead and I'm kind of doing this in a really roundabout way. I just realized I'm going to need to be able to configure my style bundles before I add it to my bundles table, so I'm aliasing it out into a variable that I can manipulate before I add it into my bundle collection. So make sure that you pull this out into a variable. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say frontendstyles.transforms.add new, and then I'm going to pass in our CSS transformer. Now the CSS transformer class comes from our bundle transformer NuGet package. And if we look at the list of parameters for its constructor, the one that we care about is the one that has an iList of iTranslators. So how do we instantiate an iList? We simply say new list, and then we pass in curly braces. So we go ahead and format this code so it's a little easier to read. So what we're doing is we're saying frontendstyles.transforms.add, we're passing in a new instantiation of CSS transformer, which we're passing a new instantiation of list of iTranslator, which we're initializing with new less translator. I know that sounds like quite a bit of stuff, but that's
my mind kind of broke. Yeah.
If you guys haven't noticed yet, the bundle transformer is very configurable, which is sometimes a good thing and sometimes a bad thing. Generally, when I see a package that adds this much configuration logic by default, I'm generally a little wary of that package. Don't worry, bundle transformer is pretty cool. It's just I'm not a big fan of its overuse of configuration. Now, that's one transform that we want to add. this will make it so that this bundle, anything added to this bundle will be processed with less. But in addition, we also want it to be minified. So we'll simply do frontendstyles.transforms.add new CSS minify. Now the reason we can add a CSS minify and we don't have to write like a less minify is by the time it gets to this step, it's already converted the less into CSS. So that's exactly what we want. Now the final thing that we have to do is actually tell our styles bundle what styles we want to be in the bundle. And the way that I'm going to architect this is we're only actually ever going to have one file in our styles, and that's going to be application.less. Application.less is actually going to import all the additional files that we'll need in order to make this work. So I'm simply going to say frontend styles dot include. I'm going to do squiggly / content styles application.less. Now note that squiggly again. See how this is asking for a virtual path? When you have a virtual path and you add a squiggly, this will replace it with the root of where this website was deployed to. So this is actually an absolute path that absolutely points to this particular application.less no matter where our directory is currently at. And this tilde will take care of the fact, tacking on the real location of our website to the beginning. Okay, so now we have all this cool stuff. We have our bundle added, but we haven't actually added or invoked register bundles from anywhere. Remember, the fact that I created a class called bundleConfig with a method called register bundles is just a convention. I haven't tied this into any part of our application yet. What I want to do is I want this method to be invoked when our application starts. To do that, I jump into my global ASICs, I go into the conveniently named application start method, and I say bundleconfig.registerBundles bundle table. Oh, come on. Bundle table.bundles. Now you'll notice that when I brought in bundle table, we got a new using system web optimization up here. Okay, we have our bundle. It is registered, which is cool.
Woohoo!
But we haven't actually included it to our layout yet. To include it into our layout, I'm going to come up here to the head element where you should be including all of your CSS, and I'm going to say at styles. Then I'm going to hit Alt-Shift-Space, Enter, or dot, sorry, render. And then I'm going to pass in styles frontend, which is the path, remember, that we set up in our style bundle right here, styles frontend. Now you'll notice that we did get a using system web optimization added to the top of our layout.systemal. Okay, I'm going to hit F6. I'm going to come over here, hit refresh, and we have a light gray background with a red header, which means our styles were applied. There's one more thing I want to do. If we go ahead and right-click and view source, you'll notice that this styles.render literally just added a link href to our application.less. So you'll be thinking, what was the point of all of this stuff? Why did we have to add this less translator and the CSS minify stuff if all styles.render is going to do is dump a straight up path directly into the application.less without transforming anything? Well, the answer is in debug mode, that's exactly what the bundles will do. They'll just dump straight up paths to all of our styles and scripts that we have added to our page. That's because in debug mode, that's typically what we want. We don't want much processing done on our files because it makes debugging more difficult. However, in production mode, it will bundle them and minify them. We can check that by going into our web.config, finding our system.web element, which is right here, finding our compilation element underneath it, and setting debug to false. Coming back here, we can refresh, It's going to take a second because it's recompiling everything, and subsequent requests should be pretty snappy, as you can see. And then if I hit right-click View Page Source, you'll notice, whoops, the link has been changed to one file. And it's this weird, crazy URL thing. And if I click on it, you'll notice that our CSS has been minified. Minified meaning all the white space and comments and all that stuff has been stripped out so that it's as small as possible when sending over the wire. Okay, so now we verified that our less preprocessor is indeed working. I'm going to jump over here and set our debug back to true. And then refresh just to make sure it's working. So our debug is now set to true, which is good. Now let's finally do what we set out to do in the beginning of this video, which was add Bootstrap to our project. So how do we do that? Well, we're actually going to be adding Bootstrap source code to our project, which gives us a lot more power and flexibility. So I'm going to say download Bootstrap, and I'm going to download the source. So click on that, and I now have a zip that was downloaded. And if I open this zip and then open this file, we will see the source code for Bootstrap. The only folders that we care about are fonts and less. We may or may not be pulling JS in later, but I don't really care about the JavaScript components quite yet. I care mostly about the CSS components. So let's go ahead and pull in less and fonts. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on Styles, and I'm going to say Open in File Explorer, which will bring us to the file on, which will bring us to the file location, or the folder location on our hard drive using File Explorer. I'm going to right-click and I'm going to select New Folder. I'm going to call it Bootstrap. Then I'm going to pull in here, go into less, and I'm going to select every single less file out of this directory. So that's going to be excluding the CSS lintrc as well as the CSS comb.json. So I want all of these less files out of the Bootstrap source distribution. And I'll just drag and drop them into my Bootstrap folder on my hard drive. The next thing I want to do is bring over the fonts. Now, fonts in Bootstrap are actually used for their icons, and we want those icons. So I'm going to back up into Content, the Content folder, which remember is the parent of the Styles folder. I'm going to create a new folder called Fonts. Inside of Fonts, I'm not surprisingly going to copy all of these fonts over. We'll need the EOT, SVG, the TIFF, or TTF, and the WAF. I love that file extension, WAF.
That's on my screen it looks like wolf, but WAF is so much cooler.
But so yeah, so now we have our fonts moved over, we have our less files moved over, and that's all good. Come back to Visual Studio and we look under Content, and whoa, we don't see our fonts or our Bootstrap. That's because although those folders exist on our hard drive, they aren't added into the project yet. The easiest way to add those folders to the project is by coming up here in our Solution Explorer and clicking this Show All Files button. And then we can simply right-click on Fonts and say Include in Project, right-click on Bootstrap, and say Include in Project. Alrighty, now we have Bootstrap and our fonts brought in. We're going to have to make a modification though. And the modification is we need to tell Bootstrap where we put our fonts, because we're not actually using the same directory structure as Bootstrap is, or Bootstrap was previously. So to do that, I'm going to jump down into our variables.less file. Variables.less file gives us a lot of cool little things that we can tweak about Bootstrap's appearance and behavior. Now you notice something a little weird here. It looks like there's a syntax error. There actually isn't a syntax error there. What's going on is the version of less that my tools are using to show me syntax highlighting are out of date, and they aren't using the latest less compiler. So Bootstrap, since it's using a newer version of less, will have syntax that my syntax highlighter can't understand. Now that's okay, because we can safely ignore it, because the real less compiler that we're using is the one that matters, the one that's going to compile our less into CSS, is the correct version. So we're just going to ignore the fact that Visual Studio thinks all this stuff is commented out, because it really isn't commented out. And we're just going to have to deal with doing some stuff without syntax highlighting. But fortunately, it's pretty straightforward because we have our variable for our font path right there. So we can simply change this on line 75 of variables.less to point to where we want our fonts to be, which is going to be /content/fonts. Sound good?
Sounds wonderful.
Alrighty. So we've now updated our font path so we can get our icons. But we still have one more problem, and that problem is we're not actually including Bootstrap into anything. Now, I could certainly go into App Start, bundle config, and I could add Bootstrap right here. I can add a reference straight up into bootstrap.less, and everything will look correct. The problem with that approach, however, is that all of the features of Bootstrap, such as all their little mix-ins and functions and variables, wouldn't be accessible to application.less. They wouldn't be accessible to application.less because application.less wouldn't know anything about Bootstrap if I included it here. So instead of including it in my bundle, I'm going to go into application.less and I'm going to include it from here. So I'm going to say import bootstrap/bootstrap.less semicolon. The semicolon is important, by the way. So now if I jump back into my web browser and hit refresh, we see that our font's changed. So did the padding of things. That's because we now know that Bootstrap's being loaded, and I can verify that by right-clicking, hitting View Source, and then clicking on my application.less. What do we see? We see all of Bootstrap being included in. Now let's go ahead and do one more thing up here on our index.html. So I'm going to go into Views Home Index, and I'm going to pull in an icon. I'm going to pull in an icon just to make sure that our font directory is correct. So let me find out where they moved. There we go. Let's bring in a heart. That sounds like fun. So I'm going to copy this bit right here. I'm going to go back into Visual Studio, and I'm going to say class glyph icon dash heart. In theory, that'll pull in our glyph icon. So if we refresh, hey, look at that. Our glyph icon is indeed being pulled in, and we know it's a glyph icon because the color is being set by our H1.
Nice.
Alrighty. So I think that's about it as far as getting our site ready for development. We now have a very powerful CSS framework that we can use to very quickly put together our website without having to go in and learn a bunch of CSS, which is really what the goal of this was. And we'll have a side effect of it being looking good. I mean, honestly, it doesn't really matter what this looks like because this is, the beginning of the project. But the fact that it will look good is not a bad thing. The last thing I want to do is I want to delete this bundle transformer.configuration.xsd. It's not that I don't want to have the schema of bundle transformer inside of my project. It's just that file name is so long it adds a horizontal scroll bar, and the only solution is to pull out my solution explorer a little bit, which means I lose some horizontal pixels, and it just turns into a mess and it's ugly and I don't like it, so I'm going to delete it. It's not necessary for anything. Alright, so the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to jump into source tree, and I'm going to commit all my changes. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to hit the stage all button. I'm going to say commit, and I'm going to say added less preprocessor, added bootstrap, added global layout, added index action. And then I'm going to say push commits immediately to origin. And I'm going to hit commit, and I'm committing.
I'm glad you're not non-committal.
Well, otherwise our source control wouldn't be used very much. And we can indeed verify that we did push, meaning these changes are on Bitbucket. All right, so I think that pretty much wraps up all I wanted to get done in this video. So we'll see you guys in the next.
Take care.